You know what it's like when you get home from a long day of work and there's nothing to eat in the house? Well, so did Louis XV. He got home and only found onions, butter, and champagne. What'd he do? He created the French onion soup, of course. So I'm gonna make this version based off his recipe and the other origin stories for this classic French soup. First thing I'm doing here is making beef stock. You can go out and buy any stock, but homemade stock does make a difference. So I'm starting off by cutting carrot, celery, and onion, and I'm gonna throw that on a sheet pan with some beef bones and stew meat, and I'm gonna roast that in the oven at 350 for about a half hour. Now let's get down to some history. As the story goes, after a long day of hunting, Louis XV returned back to his hunting lodge, the Chateau de la Muette, only to find empty cabinets and bare pantries, the only provisions being onions, butter, and champagne. And I want to reinforce that the man who also owned this small, humble home, that had this backyard, and was the King of France, sadly arrived home hungry with nothing to eat. But through his creative genius, he created one of France's most iconic dishes. Or as the story goes at least. Back to cooking, I'm throwing together some parsley, thyme, bay leaves, and coriander seed to make my own variation of a bouquet garni, which I'm just wrapping into some cheesecloth, and this is going to be used to help make the broth. And I don't care to make this pretty, I just want to tie it up so I don't lose those herbs. Taking out the roasted vegetables and beef bits, I'm going to add that to a crock pot, and then add in enough water just to cover the top. Don't forget to add that juice from the pan. Hardest part right here, I'm making it quick. And sticking with the theme, I'm using some French butter to melt into this pan. It is fairly well salted, so I actually didn't add any other salt to this dish. Now, as for the onions, how many did I chop up? Well, this actually made 6 servings, and I used just over 14 onions for this, so it was a lot. Now I'm going to caramelize those down. It's a lot of onions, so I did this in groups. I didn't want them to kind of steam. I really wanted to make sure that I was sauteing them and caramelizing them nicely, so I did this in 3 different rounds. And these are yellow onions, not Vidalia. They're not as naturally sweet, but I do prefer these. But you have to cook them lower and slower to get the golden result. Remember, this dish is all about the onions, so don't skimp out. And while I get this champagne bottle ready, let's talk about the other origin story of this soup, which coincidentally begins in Champagne. This story takes us to the town of Châlons-en-Champagne, to the hotel kitchen of La Palme d'Or. While stopping on his way to Versailles, the ex-king of Poland, Duke of Lorraine, Stanislas Leszczyński, who is the father of Maria Leszczyńska, the wife of Louis XV, stopped into the hotel for a bite and a sleep. And working the kitchen that night was none other than Nicolas Appert, the father of food sciences and canning, who made the French onion soup for Stanislas, who enjoyed it so much he demanded to know the recipe, learn it, so he could bring it back to the court of Versailles. Finishing up the last round of caramelizing the onions here, I'm going to take them out and put them in with the rest of the onions in a bowl, set that aside, and deglaze this pot with a cup and a half of champagne. There's nothing but tastiness stuck to the bottom, and I want to get that off. Adding in the onions just to get that simmering, and then I'm going to go back to working on the broth. Now with the broth, I did skim off a good amount of fat while in the crock pot, and then I ladled out the broth into a pot and reduced it down to about 2/3 of what it was, and now I'm just going to kind of strain this through the cheesecloth just to get the little chunks of herbs and carrot, etc. that may have gotten out. This is now a really concentrated, flavorful stock that I'm going to add into this pot of onions. So after all of these liquids are added into the soup, I gave it a little bit of a taste and I realized that it needed just something a little extra. So I gave it a splash of balsamic vinegar and just another bushel of thyme, and I just let it cook in there for about another 20 minutes to a half hour. And now to most people's favorite part of the soup, the gratin. I'm taking a mild Gruyere and I'm going to shred that up. While I'm doing so, let's discuss about the origins of the bread and cheese. In the markets of Les Halles, cheese was added, especially the more pungent type, to help mask the smell of alcohol coming off of those who had had a little bit too much, and bread to help the cheese afloat and to make it more of a substantial meal. So I slice up a French baguette and baste it lightly with olive oil, throw that in the oven to toast up. And I'm just going to fill up my crocks with the French onion soup. Most of the way, I am going to leave room for the bread and the cheese, and I just want to make sure that it's not too much where it's going to be overflowing everywhere. On a little side note, the crocs that are traditionally used in France are the tête de lion, which have the little lion's heads on the side. They look pretty cool. I wish I had them. And by this point, my mouth was just salivating for this. One thing I did learn here is the way that I'm putting on the toast. I found a better way to do this is to actually cut these up into little cubes beforehand. It just makes eating the soup so much easier. You want to cover these with the Gruyere, whatever cheese you're using, as much as possible. You don't want to leave any of the bread open and exposed because that will burn. That will go completely black. You want to put this in the oven at a high temperature for about, well, it doesn't really have a time. Just keep an eye on it. Just make sure that that cheese is turning golden brown. Once it's melted and golden brown, yeah, just like this, you're done. All right, my first go at French onion soup. Louis the 15th may have been the one to invent it. Let's try it out. Right off the bat, I'm just going to give you a rating. That's a 9 out of 10. It's really good. I've had French onion soups with all kinds of different cheeses, different ways of being cooked. Champagne, I don't think I've ever had, and you got to try it. Burnt my mouth a little on that one. Yep. Leave it up to somebody like a king of France to use champagne to make a soup. I'll tell you, such a simple ingredient as an onion and adding some champagne and butter, it's magical. Guys, as always, please like and subscribe, and if you have an idea for a historical recipe that you'd like to see me make, let me know in the comments.